From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Can Republicans in Congress hang together to pass a budget and extend the 2017 tax cuts? That's the big question of the 119th Congress. And so far, the answer is yes, they're making progress, but the road ahead gets rougher, especially as Democrats pull out their old reliable and target the Republican plans to reform entitlements, specifically this year Medicaid. So the battle over priorities in Congress is our subject for today on Potomac Watch. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal Opinion Pages, and I'm here with my colleagues Kate Batchelder Odell and Alicia Finley, who cover these issues for us. So let's start with this week's vote in the House of Representatives on something called a budget resolution. Just to get a little technical for you, this is the bill. It's not a budget itself. It's a bill that has an outline of a budget, and it allows the Congress to trigger a process by which the Republican Party, the majority, can pass a budget with a lot of details, taxes and spending, with 51 Senate votes instead of going through a Senate filibuster of 60 votes, which would be blocked by the Democrats. So this is very important to the whole Republican agenda, the whole Trump agenda. And there's real questions about whether they could even pass this in the House with its narrow majority. Now, they did this week, 217 to 215, with only a single Republican, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, in dissent. Of course, he votes no on everything, so that's not a surprise. But, Kate, what's the lesson here of this vote?
Well, look, I think we're seeing that Republicans are starting perhaps to understand that they do need to hang together if they want to accomplish any of their policy priorities. This process was notable because while there was some last minute drama and Johnson almost didn't hold the vote and then held it open, ended up getting the budget passed, this was in some ways less dramatic than previous Republican infightings. There were really only a few remaining holdouts before the vote that I think wanted some perhaps personal attention from Donald Trump or Mike Johnson, and both of them were able to flip those votes and get the bill passed. So I think there is at least some realization that in a narrow majority, you all have to stick together if you want to pass anything. And it's helpful, of course, that reconciliation and passing this budget shell is the only way that the Trump tax cuts from 2017 will be renewed in any form, because it's the only way to pass some of their priorities with 51 votes through the Senate. And so I think that political reality is setting in a little bit and is perhaps giving Republicans a little more reason to vote together than they've had in the past.
Big business for orthopedic surgeons in Washington with broken bones, broken arms, broken legs, and among the members to try to get them to vote for this, Alicia? Or do you think that in the end it was, apart from the massaging from Donald Trump, that they had to hang together here or their whole Congress is done?
Right, and I think they were also facing pressure from the Senate, which was advancing their own bill, a two-bill approach to budget reconciliation, which the first that they plan to do some border security with some energy provisions, tie those together, and then move on to tax reform because they didn't think the House would be able to pass it, get their act together. And so I think they were actually pleasantly surprised by this. But right, to Kate's point, if you don't get a move on, and this could, by the way, extend all the tax provisions, and they also appear to be interested in taking on some Medicaid reforms. This could take several months in itself. And so you really don't want to push this out too far into the future because then you start the more electoral politics start to come into play. And so there really is a more of an urgency to get it done now.
Before we get into the Medicaid fight, which I do want to get into in some detail, just a factual matter here. If you cannot pass this bill, the tax provisions that expire at the end of 2025 would kick in. It means that the pre-2017 provisions would return. And, Kate, that's a huge tax increase. I think the 10-year dollar number is $4.5 trillion. Specifically, that means the Democrats say, oh, this is just tax cuts on the rich. No, not at all. There's lower tax rates throughout the tax schedule with different levels of income, not merely at the top rate. You've got a pass-through provision, which has a 20% exclusion for income for small businesses that are supposed to equalize the tax treatment of business income with corporations, that their tax cuts in rates were permanent in the 2017 bill. You also have a huge cut in the standard deduction, which the 2017 bill increased almost to $30,000. So this is a huge tax increase that Republicans will end up presiding over if they can't pass this.
Right. I mean, I think Republicans were correct in 2017 to focus on making the corporate rate permanent because that was really where the growth from the tax reform, a lot of it came from. And so that is locked in. But then the price of that was that some of the individual cuts would expire. And also, that deduction for quote unquote small businesses, I mean, that would create really unequal tax treatment if there's this massively lower corporate tax rate and then the smaller businesses have to pay basically at the individual rate. So it would be a huge mess, huge tax increase on the normal middle American families would notice it for sure. You would have a return to the alternative minimum tax, which ensnares a lot of middle income filers. A lot of the structural reforms that Republicans got done would be undone. And that's why I think there will be some ability here to squeeze something through, because also the other alternative is that you have to do some really ugly deal with Democrats at the end of the year to get 60 votes in the Senate, and the price tag that Chuck Schumer would extract to renew some Republican tax cuts would be enormous. And so that is also just a really unenviable alternative to getting this reconciliation bill done.
Yeah, I think enormous doesn't quite do justice to the price that Schumer would exact. There'd be certainly an increase in the corporate tax rate. There'd be a huge increase, I think, at the top level in the income tax rate. And who knows what spending he would require. So this is, in my view, kind of do or die, or what's the point of electing a Republican House and Senate? All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the tax implications if the Republicans fail to pass their budget bill when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch, the daily podcast of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and I'm here with Alicia Finley and Kate Odell. Let's turn to the harder part here now, because having passed this shell in the House, the Senate will move ahead. I think they'll pass a comparable shell, some differences, and then they'll have to go to conference and get a final budget outline, pass the House and Senate again. That'll happen probably in the next 30 days or so. And then they have to actually write a bill, various parts of the bill, including the tax cut bill. Even that language is wrong that I just used. It's really not a tax. It's just a tax extension of current policy. So it's not a big tax cut. It would be a big increase if it doesn't pass. And I'm not sure that Republicans have driven that message home yet.
No, and actually, if you recall under Obama, what they did when the Bush tax cuts were set to expire, Democrats and Republicans extended them without trying to pay for them, except for the very top rate. And they use what's known as the current policy approach, in which you don't really have to pay for them, rather than the baseline,
built into CBA, Congressional Budget Office. That
would project if everything were to expire, so revenues would otherwise increase by $4.5 trillion. So I think they've allowed Democrats to drive the narrative too much on this. But if you were to use the current policy approach, that would free Republicans up a little bit. I think the one downside is I think there are actually real important reforms to some programs that need to be made, and maybe this finding savings gives them some kind of a pretext to do that. For example, in food stamps, Medicaids, and other entitlement programs, that you're not really cutting these programs, but you're reforming them, and you can say that you're using those savings to help pay for the tax cuts.
These would be important policy changes. Yeah. And let's talk about Medicaid, because the Democrats, this is the program that was designed back in the 60s, part of the Great Society, to help poor people or folks down on their luck who couldn't get health care. But it has evolved over the years, Kate, thanks mainly to Democrats, been expanded. So it now covers able-bodied adults, particularly after the Obamacare bill expanded Medicaid enormously. And Democrats have decided that they're going to attack any reforms that Republicans try to pass in Medicaid as a cut in Medicaid and an assault on the poor. I counted no fewer than 4 articles in Politico, all saying that if Republicans touch this, man, they are going to die, in real trouble. The New York Times put it up at the top of the page. And there are some folks on the right who say you can't touch Medicaid anymore because, some Republican voters actually are on Medicaid. But on the merits, is it possible to reform this program in a way that actually maybe is better for the folks who really need it below the poverty line.
Well, right. I mean, one of the core dysfunctions of the Medicaid expansion that happened under the Affordable Care Act is that the federal government reimburses states more for these prime age, working age adults than they do for pregnant women and those who are truly vulnerable under the poverty line. So a state now can draw down, more like 90 cents for these working adults and more like 65 cents for pregnant women. And
this is for every dollar.
Right. And so that, I think, is really dysfunctional and an argument where Republicans can win. I mean, Mike Johnson was saying last night on CNN, look, we're not talking about the people the program was intended for, but we are looking, for instance, 29-year-old men who are not working and to get them back to work through a work requirement. That would be one thing that Republicans could do. But I think the program also does need more fundamental reform that they could defend. And that would include rationalizing the way that the federal government pays for these enrollees. There are so many improper payments going out through Medicaid. For instance, the states have never been very scrupulous about who they're enrolling and whether they're eligible. And for instance, maybe if your income goes up the next year, you're no longer eligible. States are not good about noticing that and dealing with it. So I think there are a number of things that could save real money that Republicans could defend if they learn the arguments. There's reason to be less than optimistic about that because a lot of this GOP conference is new and they were not around for the debate over repealing the Affordable Care Act. But there are real popular arguments about work and about protecting the vulnerable that are very potent if Republicans choose to make them.